The Holy Gospel is according to St. Matthew, the 2nd chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now after the wise men had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. And this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. And then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled, because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared to Joseph in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." And then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. And there he made his home in a town called Nazareth. So what had been spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Be seated. Christmas has now come and gone, Christmas Day at least, even though, again, we're technically in the season, that is the 12 days of Christmas. And nevertheless, our gospel readings this morning remind us that the story of Jesus' birth is not quite finished yet, is it? The actual birth story, of course, is found in Luke 2, as we heard on Christmas Eve. But here in Matthew 2, the first Sunday after Christmas, we have, in a sense, a continuation of the story. However, we do have a tendency to conflate or combine the two accounts, don't we? In particular, especially as evidenced by our decorative nativity scenes, where we typically have the three magi or wise men visiting the Holy Family right there in the stable along with the shepherds. But a closer reading of these verses in Matthew makes it clear that this was simply not so. In other words, the common practice today of placing the visit of the wise men shortly after the birth of Jesus, while he was actually still lying in a manger in that stable, is highly unlikely. Why? Well, for three reasons. First, in verse 11 of our second reading this morning, Matthew tells us that when the star led the wise men to the place where Jesus was, he uses the Greek word paidion, or child, whereas Luke, in referring to the newborn Jesus, uses the word brephos, or baby, instead. And so it would certainly appear that we're dealing with a toddler, not a newborn here. And second, in that same verse 11, we read on entering the house. And this would certainly seem to imply that some time had passed since Jesus' birth, wouldn't it? Moreover, that they had been able to move out of that stable and into more comfortable accommodations in someone's house instead. And third, the conclusion that some time had passed since Jesus' birth is also confirmed for us later in verse 16. Because as we heard, when Herod realized that he had been duped by the wise men, who had returned home by another road without returning first to inform him of the child's whereabouts, we're told that infuriated Herod immediately sent some men to kill, quote, all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. In other words, when the wise men had their audience with King Herod, and they had asked him where they might find this child who was born king of the Jews, obviously they must have also indicated to him at the very same time that according to their calculations, at least, this child could now be almost 2 years old. And so Herod then ruthlessly acted on that information in horrific fashion. A tragic event which came to be known as the slaughter of the innocents. We'll come back to this a little later. Now, there has been and continues to be a lot of confusion about these visitors from the east including and maybe even especially among children. For instance, 3 small boys were once in a Christmas play at their church, and they were picked to represent the 3 wise men. It was their job, of course, to give their respective gifts to the baby Jesus. And the first boy stepped forward, held out his gift, and said proudly, "Gold." And the second boy stepped forward, held out his gift, and said, "Myrrh." And finally, the third little boy, obviously a little confused about the pronunciation and nature of his gift, stepped forward, held out the gift, and said to the audience with great gusto, "Frank sent this." And then there's the one sent in by Brenda Roberts of Stone Mountain, Georgia. "I was reading the story of Jesus' birth to my daycare children one morning," she writes. "What do we call the 3 wise men?" I asked. "The 3 maggots," replied the bright 5-year-old. "And what did the Magi bring baby Jesus?" I corrected. "Gold, Frankensteins, and Smurfs," said the same 5-year-old. Or what about the little boy who once got a huge laugh and a standing ovation from the congregation after proudly announcing, "We are the 3 kings, and we are bringing gifts of gold, common sense, and fur." Prompted the pastor to proclaim, "I've never enjoyed a Christmas program as much as this one," as he wiped tears of laughter from his eyes. "For the rest of my life, I'll never hear the Christmas story again without thinking of gold, common sense, and furs," he said. And finally, there's my favorite about the art contest held in a local school down in East Texas one Christmas season a number of years ago. One of the prize winners apparently was a picture drawn by a 9-year-old boy showing the 3 wise men offering gifts to the baby Jesus in his manger. But what made the picture unique, however, was how the gift presenters arrived at the stable. You see, there was a bright red fire truck depicted off to the side. And naturally, the school principal asked the boy about his decision to draw a fire truck in his picture of the 3 wise men. And the boy, in his heavy East Texas accent, was quick to reply, "Well, the Bible says the men came from afar." As humorous as these may be, they're not the only misconceptions, however. For example, the idea that there were 3 visitors from the East was simply a logical assumption, given that there were, of course, 3 gifts. Matthew's account, the only biblical reference to this visit, simply says, as we heard, wise men. It does not indicate how many there were. There could have been 4, for that matter, or even 10. We just don't know. Moreover, the idea that these 3 visitors were kings was undoubtedly a later tradition as well, probably based on a reading of Psalm 72, verse 11, which says, "May all kings bow down before him." Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, let's take a quick moment to further separate fact from fiction in today's gospel readings. We now know, of course, that these visitors from the East were not kings, nor were there necessarily 3 of them. And we also know that despite the popular notion in every Christmas movie ever made, not to mention all of our manger scenes at home, that they never actually visited the baby Jesus in the stable, but more than likely visited him months, even a year or more, later in the house where Mary and Joseph and their young child were now staying. So then who were these 3 wise men from the East? The words wise men in our reading this morning are actually a translation of a single Greek word, magos, or magi, which is where our word magician comes from. The term magi was given by the Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and others to a special learned class of wise men, teachers, priests, physicians, and astrologers who read the stars and interpreted dreams. Consequently, they indeed came from the East, or around modern-day Iraq and Iran. And being that they were astrologers, it only stands to reason then that they would also identify a sign in the sky in the form of a star, and then follow that star to the place where it led them. Now, whether this heavenly body was a star, or a nova, or a comet, or even the conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn, as some have speculated, that apparently occurred around that time, we'll probably never know for sure. But Paul Meyer, who taught history at Western Michigan University, in his book, First Christmas, The True and Unfamiliar Story, offers this possible interpretation, however. The following, then, is a possible astronomical reconstruction of what happened on that first Christmas, he writes. The remarkable conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn in 7 to 6 BC alerted the Magi to important developments in Palestine, where the astrological significance closely paralleled what they had learned from Hebrew lore about a star heralding the expected Messiah. In the comet of 5 BC, he noted, known as William's number 52, dramatically underscored this interpretation and sent them on their way, while it was the nova or comet of 4 BC, known as William's 53, he says, which appeared after they had reached Jerusalem and were seeking further information from Herod. The whole point here, I guess, is that amidst all the misconceptions and inaccuracies surrounding the visit of the Magi, there is still a great deal of truth and fact contained in these verses that make up the 2nd chapter of Matthew. And while we may never know exactly what happened or how these events actually unfolded, we are can nevertheless have some confidence that something very much like what Matthew is describing for us here undoubtedly did happen. Women, of course, know exactly what I'm talking about here, don't they? Who else but a bunch of men would wander around in the desert for up to 2 years, never once asking for directions until the very end? In fact, it's often been said that things would have turned out very differently if it had been wise women who came to visit Jesus instead of wise men. First of all, they would have asked for directions, and therefore they would have made it to Bethlehem in time for the birth as well. Second, they would have helped with the delivery, cleaned up the stable, made a casserole so Mary and Joseph would have had something to eat. And third, instead of bringing gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they would have brought some practical gifts like diapers, wipes, bibs, and baby formula. But nevertheless, behind all those cute and cuddly and quaint traditions surrounding today's gospel readings, there lurks a far darker, more sinister story, however.